losses without losing too many men. They can't afford to. They're too small and weak at that point. They want to demoralize the enemy. They want to keep the enemy off balance. But they can't afford to fight a pitched battle. They have to choose the times when they can attack, when they know they can win and get away. If they try to hold territory, then they know that they'll be subject to attack by others when the others choose, when the others are ready. So this is what the Gadianton robbers do early on. But the trick in guerrilla warfare is that if they're ever going to actually win the war, they have to eventually transform themselves into a conventional army. They have to hold territory, because that's what their ultimate aim is. The question is when to do it. When are you ready? You don't want to do it too early. You don't want to commit the error of what Mao called premature regularization. Well, Mao made that mistake. Vo Nguyen Giap in North Vietnam made that mistake, and others have made that mistake. And the Gadianton robbers also make it. They get very confident. They feel that they have the Nephites on the run. And so they come down out of the mountains and they besiege the Nephites in their cities. But the Nephites turn the tables on them. The Nephites launch the scorched earth campaign. They burn the crops that they don't take with them into the cities. The cities are fortified. The cities, in effect, become their mountain range. Now the Gadianton robbers are out there on the outside, and they're starving, and they have to scatter to forage for food. The Nephites then turn around and make quick sorties, when they feel like it, out of their fortified cities, picking off small groups of Gadianton robbers until they demoralize the Gadiantons and eventually defeat them. They've turned the circumstances around because the Gadiantons made a fundamental strategic error. And that's what you have in the Book of Mormon. Now, the Book of Mormon, in that regard, is totally different than the kind of warfare that you would expect Joseph Smith to be describing. Joseph was a child of his era, and I don't mean to downgrade him in any way, but I do say that he grew up in a time when there were still Revolutionary War veterans around. There were certainly still veterans of the War of 1812 around, and they loved to get together for parades. It's kind of hard for us to imagine in our late 20th century anti-military cynicism. But patriotism was very much in fashion in those days. They loved parades. They loved uniforms. Joseph Smith loved parades and uniforms. He loved to review the Nauvoo Legion in Nauvoo. He loved his title of Lieutenant General conferred upon him by the Illinois legislature. He loved all of those things, and yet those things are totally invisible. They're notable for their absence in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon's characterization of war is unromantic. There are no uniforms, no fife and drums, no parades. It's very grim. It was written, in fact, by people who participated in warfare and did not see it as romantic. Mormon, one of those very distinct personalities visible in the Book of Mormon, is, if anything, cynical and misanthropic. He has a negative attitude toward human nature because all he's seen, he says, from his youngest days is one endless scene of continuous bloodshed and destruction and immorality, and for him there's no glamour there at all. The Book of Mormon was not written by Joseph Smith. It would have been a very different book in its military passages, which are lengthy, if he had written it, but he didn't. One other item should be pointed out about military and war accounts in the Book of Mormon. For a long time, scholars thought that war was almost absent from Mesoamerica, the area where most Latter-day Saint scholars think the story of the Book of Mormon took place. And they said the Book of Mormon was wrong because it portrays a scene of continuous warfare. Yet the ancient Maya were thought to be a peaceful people who simply tended their fields and got along well one with another. Well, of course, I can't think of any period in human history where warfare has been completely absent. Unfortunately, it's been with us all the time. But we now know that the archaeologists were simply overlooking the evidence for warfare. They were literally stepping over the evidence of fortifications, walls around cities, and so on that we now know is there. Another thing was they were simply missing the evidence of armor in the Mesoamerican setting. We have wall reliefs, for example, that show armored warriors. We know that war was a constant activity, and that the ancient Maya, who may or may not be identical with certain Book of Mormon peoples, were among the most bloodthirsty people in the history of the world. Another topic that I'd like to discuss in connection with the Book of Mormon, and a more peaceful and pleasant one, is the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, some will probably be asking themselves, what Feast of Tabernacles? It's never mentioned in the Book of Mormon, and that's true, and in some ways that's the beauty of it, I would say. If you look very, very carefully at King Benjamin's address in the Book of Mormon, as my friend and colleague John Twetness has done, you discover that clearly what's going on there is a Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, as it was known in ancient Israel, and is still known today, is a time when Jews, and they still do it today, live in tents for a few days. And the idea is to remember the days when their ancestors were nomads in the wilderness. It was originally a kind of harvest festival. It comes in that time of the year. It's a time when people would dwell in the tents out in the fields. But today you can go to areas of New York City and see similar tents, or booths as they're called, on the landings of apartments. Well, what relevance does this have to the story of King Benjamin? You may remember that when King Benjamin speaks, his audience are sitting out there in little tents that they've put in the field around the temple where he's speaking. We also find out from accounts that are scattered throughout the Old Testament. You'd have to be a first-rate Old Testament scholar to put this all together, and no one did it until John Twentus did it, just in the latter part of this century. You'd have to be able to put this all together, and then you would realize that the Feast of Tabernacles was an excellent time, considered the time par excellence, for coronations and for ceremonies involving the king. Well, of course, King Benjamin's address is the time when he announces that he's stepping down and announces that his son Mosiah will be taking over the kingship. This is a case where I had read that account many, many times, but after I had read John's account of the Feast of Tabernacles, I was never able to read it again in the same way.